So as a companion video to my how to feed otos and farlowellas video, which I just published on how to prepare food for these sorts of fish, I thought I'd put together a quick video showing how I actually feed the food. I mentioned in that video that I feed these veggies on skewers, and you can see two examples, or three technically examples, of using skewers in your aquarium. So I literally just added these slices of zucchini that have been blanched, and if you're curious on how I did that, please refer to my other video on how to prepare it. After blanching them, about 2 minutes ago, I added these 3 slices of zucchini to this aquarium. This is a 90-gallon blackwater tank. I apologize, it does have quite a bit of excess algae that I've been neglecting for a while. I'm in the middle of redoing a few tanks, and I've had a little bit of neglect for the blackbeard algae and such that have been growing here. So don't see this as being a reflection on what happens when you feed this food, just see it as a little bit of neglect in a tank that's otherwise very healthy. I've skewered the zucchini on these bamboo sticks here. So I've got one skewer in the middle in a low flow section that has 2 slices on it. I've got one skewer in the top. It's actually suction cup to the glass that keeps the zucchini in the flow. So I don't know if you can see here, but this spray bar, this temporary spray bar arrangement here, comes up and goes the full width of the tank, or length of the tank. It's got nozzles that agitate the surface, but it's also got nozzles that point straight down. So this skewer here is in the flow, directly in the output flow. This one here in the back is sort of out of the flow, and it's a bit more sheltered. So there's a few reasons that I've got different ways of feeding. The first is in this lower flow section, it's good for fish that tend to be a little bit more timid. So for particularly the otos, even though the otos are, because they're trained to accept food here, they've already latched onto the zucchini and they're feeding. They sometimes appreciate having a little bit more shelter in order to go after their food. If I were to move here very quickly, they'd all scatter to the 4 winds. So they like being a little bit more tucked into the anubias, into the crypts there. And it lets them have a place of shelter where they can eat, but then if they were to, they could dash off into the undergrowth again. Whereas some other fish, and particularly the farlowellas, when I first got them, they needed the food in the higher flow area. Most people are probably familiar with seeing their farlowellas, and mine's defying expectations by being tucked into the back there between the 2 zucchini slices. But when I first got him, and he's a him from the bristles on his nose, he was always glued to the glass, and most people are used to seeing farlowellas glued to the glass. That's because they tend to like staying in higher flow areas, and they tend to like having places to stretch out their entire body. So point 1 that I will make about feeding these sorts of fish is, do be aware that you may have to train them to take food. So once you've got food that you're fairly confident that they will benefit from, you may have to train them to see that as food. So I start off by, if you haven't seen my other video, I'll just quickly run down what I feed. So in addition to the zucchini, which I blanch, and if you're curious what blanching is, again, please check out that other video. But I feed zucchini, I feed cucumber, which is slightly less nutritious, but is a little easier to find sometimes. I feed basil, I feed spinach, I feed peppers. They don't seem to like the green peppers very much, but they'll take red, yellow, or orange peppers as I can find them. And those are prepared in advance so that they don't, they're more likely to find them as food. So by blanching them in advance, that's essentially boiling them and then freezing them. It breaks down the tissue structures a little bit. If you don't want to go to that sort of effort, what you can also do is just cut them up, put them into a glass of water that you set on top of your aquarium for a day or 2, let it get a little bit scummy, and then add it to your tank. I know it's defying all kinds of internet lore about people being terrified about these veggies fouling their water, but you do need to train the fish to see this stuff as food. So to circle back to my original point, if you've got new fish, and I don't know how many times I've heard people say, I've tried to feed my otos, I put a slice of cucumber or a slice of zucchini in there, and then they didn't see it as food and I took it out at the end of the day. Well, when I've got a new batch of wild-caught otos in, it can take 3, 4, 5 days for them to actually see the first slice of zucchini as food. So it will break down, it will become a bit messy, and I just don't care. I do water changes regularly enough that it doesn't make any difference whatsoever. The sword plant in the background there that's breaking down is because its root structures become uncovered. That's fouling the water more than a slice of zucchini is going to. If you're really worried for the first day or two when you start adding vegetables, just plan on adding your vegetables right after you do a water change. Leave it in there for as long as it takes for your fish to see it as food, and then do a water change right afterwards. Monitor your nitrates every day if it'll give you a sense of security. But really, you do have to give them time to be able to have the slices of zucchini break down enough that they can see it as food. And then after that point, particularly if you're feeding in consistent locations, they'll see it as food right away. So right before I started this video camera, I added the slices into the tank. As you can see, I've got probably a dozen cherry shrimp on the top piece. I've got at least 4 or 5 otos, the farlowella, and a bunch of shrimp on the lower sections, and they're all nomming down. They know where I feed them, they know what I feed them, and they expect the food to be there on a regular basis. So be prepared to experiment with putting slices in high flow areas and low flow areas, and just experiment to see what your fish will take. So be aware that otos in particular will strip a tank of the types of algae that they can eat very, very, very quickly. So the usual cycle of what happens is that most people will say, okay, I've got an algae problem. So they'll see their diatom bloom of algae that happens at the beginning of every tank. They'll freak out. They'll go to their pet store who will recommend otos. They'll get, if they're being typical, they'll buy 1 or 2. If they're being really good, they'll have done a little bit of research and found out that otos should be kept in groups, and so they'll buy 6 or 7. And then they'll bring their new critters home, dump them in the tank. The otos will decimate the algae population within a day or two, and then the otos will mysteriously, quote-unquote, start dying off over the next month or 2. They're not mysteriously dying off, they're just starving to death. So it seems to be pretty common for people to understand that they have to feed their fish, but for some reason otos don't fall into that category. So they feed their cories, they feed their rainbows, they feed their goldfish, but they don't feed their otos. It's very possible to keep otos alive on supplemental food, but it requires training them the same way that it would if you got a wild-caught puffer and you had to train it to accept non-live foods. Your fish aren't going to naturally just assume that this vegetable from the refrigerator is food as they've seen it in the wild. I mean, remember that a lot of, or basically all otos and farlowellas are wild-caught. There's a very few number of folks like myself who've made efforts to breed them in captivity, even fewer that have actually sold any, so your fish are going to be wild-caught, and they're not going to see domestic sources of food as food for a long time. Now, most people will try and use some rule of thumb that says number of gallons per oto to try and figure out how many the tank is likely to support. This is a 90-gallon tank. It has 50 otos of various species, and I don't even know how many dozens of cherry shrimp and amano shrimp and a farlowella now all have common food sources, and they would all be dead by now if I required the tank to feed them. But they've stayed alive on supplemental foods. So, the big bruiser oto huarani, which are the ones with the stripy tails, they're the larger otos. They eat a lot of food. The little vittatus, or the quote-unquote pygmy vittatus that you see on there, are the more normal ones that most people see. But, these bigger fish do take a lot of food, so please do feed them. Start out with healthy stock, so when you get your otos or your farlowellas home, have a quarantine tank set up in advance. So, if you're really thinking ahead, set up a quarantine tank with a light, get some good algae growth going on there, and have the tank just disgusting and full of algae with clean water, so that when they come home they have a first meal of food that they're used to seeing. So they're used to feeding on algae. They'll see algae as a food source far more quickly than any sort of prepared food. And then once they've done with that meal, then you can start introducing these sorts of prepared foods. So in addition to your veggies, give them a few shrimp pellets, give them a little bit of Soylent Green. Those are 2 additional foods that I use on a regular basis here, and start to see what they'll accept. So in quarantine as well, and do quarantine your fish. Again, being wild caught, they will come in with a gutload of parasites a mile long. If you want to see a really good series of videos on quarantine, go over to Aquarium Co-op. Corey's got a great series on quarantining fish and how to deal with that. I've adopted his quarantine program very readily and very happily and very successfully. So all of the fish that you see here have been treated with ICAX, EM erythromycin, and General Cure as part of my quarantine series, based off of a Camellinus redworm infection that I got from some purchased endlers. I'm also going to be adding levamisole to my quarantine routine. But watch his videos on how to quarantine fish properly. I've had much more success, particularly with the farlowellas, since I've implemented that. The otos, I find, despite people saying that they're very sensitive fish, I find them very bomb-proof. I had a lot of trouble keeping farlowellas thriving, or doing more than just surviving, before I dewormed them. Since I started deworming them, I mean, you can see this guy here, he's defying most laws of geometry and fitting into places that he shouldn't, and just sort of enjoying life and thriving ever since he's sort of got off on the right foot. So the brocas here went through the same routine, the shrimp here went through the same routine, the plants here went through the same routine before they were added to the main display tank, and I haven't had any problems with disease in this big tank as a result of that. So start out on the right foot, feed your fish well, and do feed them. I find it very discouraging to see a lot of people wonder why their fish are dying off and blaming capture methods or cyanide, or blaming mistreatment during the shipping process on why their fish are dying. To some degree that will happen on occasion, but more often than not the fish are starving to death. So adding a little bit of veggie supplementation will make everybody happier. So if we take another quick stock look, we can see, cherry shrimp, we've got brocas that we're feeding there, I've got pygmy cories that are coming in, I've got at least 3 species of Otocinclus there. They're all enjoying their veggie meal, and it's good for them. It provides the bulk that they need, and it provides the nutrients that they need in order to live good, happy, successful lives. So by doing that, you can keep a good tank alive, you can keep a good tank thriving. I've had all of these fish that can breed in this tank breed, so I should correct myself there. So the brocas are new enough that they haven't bred yet, and the farlowella doesn't have a mate, so he obviously hasn't bred, but the otos have produced fry, the pygmy cories have produced fry, the cherry shrimp have produced fry. I have no idea if the mono shrimp have, but they won't survive in freshwater anyway. So this tank is actually set up quite well to support them. It uses RO water directly as a feed source. The KH is maintained around 2 or 3 by the substrate, which is pure peat, and I use fertilizer supplementation. I'm playing with lighting to get the algae down, but honestly I'm not really all that worried about it, because a little bit of algae is just a little bit more filter for the tank as well, and the water is always absolutely sparkling clean. So if you can maintain a good environment, you can feed your fish, and you can do it in a way that they can start to recognize as food, you can end up with a tank that defies most people's expectations about what you can keep. So I hope you enjoy your fish. I hope you enjoy your otos in particular, which are a real soft spot for me. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to leave me any feedback, and I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. So have a great evening, folks, and keep changing that water.